Hey there, YouTube. I just wanted to go ahead and make a video on Syria. And I think it's important that we look at Syria objectively right now, especially since it's being hyped up by the media. And they want us to feel a certain way about it, so they're only showing us a certain side of things. As most of you know, who's probably watching this channel, but many of you maybe not. Most of you will understand what I say when I mean we don't get facts. We get spin. We don't get facts. We get Republican spin, we get Democratic spin, we get conservative spin, we get the liberal spin, we get libertarian spin, we get all kinds of spin, but we don't actually get the facts. So you have a group of people that want you to feel a certain way about something, so they're going to show you what they think is going to motivate you to react in a certain way. So what I want to do is look at Syria objectively and say, well, what is actually going on here? Like, why do they want me to feel this way? And what does my involvement have to do with this? And what does my feeling have to do with this? And after this, I'll make a video as well stating my opinions. Right now, I just want to objectively present the facts and allow you to make your own assumptions as to what you feel is going on in Syria. Born on September 11, 1965, as the second son of Syrian ruler Hafez al-Assad. Raised in Damascus, he graduated from the medical school of Damascus University in 1988. He then served in the Syrian army as a doctor for 4 years. After this, he went to London to study ophthalmology. In 1994, his older brother died in a car crash. Bashar was recalled to Syria to assume his brother's position as heir apparent. He entered the military academy at Horns in 1994, and he rose to the ranks to colonel by 1999. To establish his power base, older officers were forced into retirement. Younger, newer Alawite officers were promoted into their places. And you might be asking, well, who were the Alawites? Well, they're a branch of Islam, a very small sect of Islam, mostly in Syria, who believe in a Trinity deity who appears multiple times throughout history. This deity consists of Ali, Muhammad, and Salman the Persian. They are all very small sects of Syrian Islamists and have comprised about 11% of the population in Syria. And Bashar al-Assad and his father both belong to this group, the Alawites. And they actually put a bunch of people into power with them that are also Alawites. Parallel to his political career, Bashar was also engaged in public affairs. He was granted wide powers and became the head of the Bureau to receive public complaints. He also led a campaign against corruption. With this, he was able to remove potential rivals for president. In 1998, Bashar took control of the Lebanon file, which up until this point, the vice president, one of the few Sunni officials in the cabinet, had handled. The vice president up until this point had been a contender for president. Bashar pushed an ally of his into power in Lebanon by endorsing him and conversely not endorsing his rival, and furthered his influence in Lebanon. In 2000, Bashar was elected president on an unopposed ballot. Immediately after he took office, a reform movement cautiously took place, shutting down of Meza prison, granting amnesty to hundreds of Muslim Brotherhood members. However, security crackdowns began within the year. Assad also makes Syria's link with Hezbollah an important part of his security doctrine. In 2005, the former Prime Minister of Lebanon was assassinated. He and Assad did not have good relations. Hariri's death was blamed on Assad. In 2007, Bashar was elected to another term with 97.6% of the vote, again unopposed. In his foreign policy, Bashar is an outspoken critic of the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Now we get into where the beginnings of the civil war start. In January 2011, mass protests begin. Protesters called for mass reform and civil rights, as well as an end to the state of emergency that had been imposed in 1963. Protests on March 18th and 19th were the largest Syria had ever seen, and the Syrian Authority responded with violence. Bashar at first wavered between force and hints of reform. In April of 2011, the U.S. imposed sanctions against the Assad government. This was followed by Barack Obama's executive order against Assad specifically, and 6 other senior officials in Syria. In April, Bashar lifted the state of emergency and then set off a series of withering crackdowns against the protests. He sent tanks into restive cities as security forces and opened fire on demonstrators, seeking to quell the protests quickly with the display of force. On May 23rd of 2011, the EU met in Brussels and imposed travel bans and asset freezes on Assad and 9 of his ranking officials. On May 24th, Canada imposed sanctions of Syrian officials, including Assad. On June 20th, in response to demands of protesters and foreign pressure, Assad promised dialogue involving movement towards reform and greater freedom. He urged refugees to return home from Turkey, assuring them amnesty and blaming the unrest on conspiracy saboteurs. In July of 2011, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that Assad had lost legitimacy as president. During the summer, thousands of Syrian military members defected and began launching attacks against the government. On August 18th, U.S. President Barack Obama issued a statement urging Bashar to step aside. Also in August, a popular cartoonist was arrested and tortured for his criticized portrayals of government officials, including Assad. In October of 2011, Syria's Russian allies repeatedly vetoed Western-sponsored draft resolutions in the UN Security Council that would have left open UN sanctions or even military intervention against the Syrian government. In December, the United Nations declared the Syrian situation on the verge of civil war. The United States and other countries around the world condemned Assad. Syria was expelled from the Arab League. Assad was cited as saying, "This simply showed that the Arab League was no longer Arab." In December of 2011, Assad agreed to let League observers into the country, but their presence did little to quell the violence. In January of 2012, it was reported by Reuters that 5,000 civilians and protesters had been killed by the Syrian military, and 1,100 had been killed by terrorist armed forces. On January 10th, Bashar gave a speech in which he maintained that the uprising was being fueled by foreign countries, and that victory was nearer by the Syrian forces. Assad also said that he was not opposed to an Arab-brokered solution as long as national sovereignty was maintained. In February 2012, the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to approve a resolution condemning President Assad's unbridled crackdown, but China and Russia blocked all efforts for stronger action. On February 27th, Syria claims that a proposal for a new constitution to be drafted is supported by 90% during the relevant referendum. The referendum introduced a 14-year limit for the presidency. The EU pronounced even more sanctions on the Syrian regime. Tensions began to bleed over into neighboring Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan. July in 2012, Russian Foreign Minister denounces Western powers for what he said amounted to blackmail, thus provoking civil war in Syria. July 15th, the Red Cross declared Syria to be in a state of civil war, as the nationwide death toll for all sides was estimated at around 20,000. In Damascus and Aleppo, the opposition had formed themselves around a group calling themselves the Free Syrian Army. From refugee camps on the Turkish side of the border, the Free Syrian Army received weapons, medical supplies, and increased finances. June 2012, Turkey changes diplomatic relations with Syria. After a Turkish plane is shot down over Syria, Turkey announces that if Syrian troops are seen near the border, they will be perceived as a threat. July of 2012, the Free Syrian Army blows up 3 security chiefs in Damascus and seizes Aleppo to the north. August of 2012, Prime Minister Riyad Hajib defects from the Syrian government. U.S. President Obama warns that use of chemical weapons would tilt the U.S. towards intervention. October of 2012, fires in Aleppo destroy much of the historic market, and fighting and firebombing continue all throughout Syria. November 2012, the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces forms in Qatar, but excludes Islamist militias. The Arab League does not yet recognize the coalition. The US, Britain, France, Turkey, and Gulf states recognize the coalition as legitimate representative of the Syrian people. January 6, 2013, Assad gives his first public speech since June, again blaming the conflict on his enemies outside of Syria. However, he said that he was still open to a political solution, saying, "Failed attempts at a solution does not mean we are not interested in a political solution." In January of 2013, Syria blamed Israel for a bombing of a military base near Damascus, where Hezbollah was suspected of assembling a convoy of anti-aircraft missiles bound for Lebanon. June of 2013, UN reports state that 90,000 people have been killed thus far during the civil war. September of 2013, UN weapons inspectors conclude that chemical weapons were used in an attack on the Ghouta area of Damascus in August that killed 300 people. No allocation was assigned to the attack. Assad and the Syrian government allowed the UN to destroy chemical weapon stocks to be completed by June of 2014. December of 2013, US and Britain suspend non-lethal support for rebels in northern Syria after reports that ISIS seized bases of the Western-backed coalition. January through February of 2014, UN-brokered peace talks in Geneva are a failure, mostly because the Assad-led government refuses to discuss a transitional government. March of 2014, Syrian and Hezbollah forces retake Yabrud, the last coalition stronghold near the Lebanese border. In June, ISIS militants declare a caliphate in territory from Aleppo to eastern Iraqi province of Diyala. In September, the US and 5 Arab countries launch airstrikes against ISIS around Aleppo and Raqqa. January 2015, Kurdish forces push ISIS out of Kobane on the Turkish border after 4 months of fighting. May of 2015, ISIS seizes Palmyra in central Syria and destroys monuments at a pre-Islamic World Heritage Site. The Jaysh al-Fatah, the Army of Conquest, Islamic rebels take control of the Idlib province. They begin to put pressure on the coastal controlled bases of the Syrian government. September of 2015, Russia carries out its first airstrikes in Syria, saying that they are targeting the ISIS groups, but Western groups say that Russia is attacking anti-Assad rebel groups. December of 2015, the Syrian army allows rebels to evacuate the remaining areas of Homs, returning Syria's third largest city to government control after 4 years. In March of 2016, the Syrian government reclaims Palmyra from ISIS with Russian air assistance. In August of 2016, Turkish groups cross over into Syria to help the coalition troops push back against ISIS militants and Kurdish-led rebel groups from a section of the Kurdish border. December of 2016, Syrian forces again lose Palmyra to ISIS, but reclaim Aleppo, the country's largest city, depriving the coalition of their last remaining stronghold. In January of 2017, Russia, Iran, and Turkey agreed to enforce a ceasefire between the Syrian government and the coalition after talks between the two sides in Kazakhstan. April of 2017, a chemical weapon attack occurs in the coalition-held town of Khan Sheikhoun. The Syrian government is immediately blamed by now US President Donald Trump and other world leaders. On April 6 of 2017, US President Donald Trump orders 50 Tomahawk missiles fired at the Syrian government-controlled airbase that planes allegedly flew from to stage the chemical attack against Khan Sheikhoun. April 12, 2017, Russia stands behind the Syrian government and claims that Assad had nothing to do with the chemical attacks and that it was the work of extremists. This is where we are today. What do you think? Is Bashar al-Assad guilty of what he's been accused of? Or is something bigger going on? In a UN report, it was stated that both sides of this conflict are guilty of war crimes, to include murder, torture, rape, and forced disappearances. Beyond this, ISIS and the coalition members have blocked food, water, and health services for civilians. The death toll in Syria is between 321,000 and 470,000.